Thank you. I smell a landslide on Tuesday. Oh, I've been on the road for 19 months now, and a little over thank you, MAGA. I lost a lot of friends and a lot of family, but I have a much bigger family now. And we're all held together by blood and by DNA, and that is our basic relationships in our lives. But the most important relationships come from shared values. And everybody in this auditorium shares the value. They love this country and they love freedom. And they love our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. And I saw those things in danger in a very acute way during the COVID pandemic. And that is one of the principal reasons that I made the decision 19 months ago to run for President of the United States. And then a little over a year ago, I left the Democratic Party. That was a difficult decision for me because the Democratic Party was the home for me, that it was incomprehensible to me that I would ever leave it. My great-great-grandparents came over here, all of them, in 1848 during the height of the potato famine. They landed on the docks of Boston, penniless, and they were met there by the Democratic Party, and the party took care of them. It found them homes, it found them jobs, it located them in communities, it was where their churches were, and it gave them a sense of value and community and a love for this country. And my great-grandfather, Honey Fitz, was the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. His contemporary, Patrick Kennedy, was a state senator and a political boss in Boston. My uncle, John Kennedy, was the first Irish Catholic president. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, was the second longest serving member of the United States Senate. My father was a U.S. senator and attorney general and died running for president of the United States. And it was inconceivable to me that I would ever leave the Democratic Party. But I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. The Democratic Party that I grew up with was the party of peace. It was the party of civil rights and constitutional rights, and particularly freedom of speech. It was a party that had skepticism toward the CIA and the national security state. It was the party that was also skeptical of Wall Street and the corporate domination of American democracy. It was the party of women's rights. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, wrote Title IX to make sure that women could play sports in college. And it was the party of democracy. It was the party that fought hard to make sure that every American had the right to vote for the candidate that they chose to vote for. Today's Democratic Party is the party of war. It's the party of Dick Cheney. It's the party of John Bolton. These were the people who lied us into the Iraq War, the greatest foreign policy cataclysm in American history. These are the men who wrote the Patriot Act that introduced the surveillance state and gave the CIA permission to spy on Americans, to propagandize Americans. It's the party that is trying to dismantle Title IX and let men play women's sports. The party I grew up with was the party of cops and firefighters and working people. And now, that's the Republican Party. The Democratic Party today is no longer the party that is skeptical of the CIA. The CIA and the neocons wrote Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic Convention, the most bellicose, pugnacious speech that we've ever seen at a Democratic convention. Before she went on, she was immediately preceded by a former CIA director. This would be unthinkable in the Democratic Party I grew up in. They've become the party of the swamp. They've become the party of Wall Street, of big tech, of big data, of big pharma, of big ag, big chemical, and the military-industrial complex. And their party not of civil rights, but of division that is tearing our country apart. And so I made a decision to run for president 19 months ago. A little over a year ago, I left the Democratic Party for all of those reasons. And then in August of this year, President Trump called me on August 23rd, immediately after his shooting at Butler. He called me 3 hours later on the telephone, and he asked me to meet with him the next day in Milwaukee. And we had a 2.5-hour meeting then and a number of subsequent meetings. And during those meetings, he urged me to unify our parties and to work with him to reclaim the values that Robert Kennedy stood for, that John Kennedy stood for. He said he wanted to end the forever wars and bring that $200 billion that we've sent to the Ukraine home to rebuild America. He told me that he wanted to end the censorship and end the surveillance and the propaganda. And that he wanted to put an end to the weaponization of law enforcement agencies against the American political system. And that he wanted to end this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that has turned our regulatory agencies predatory against the American public. And he said that he wanted to make America healthy again. And end the chronic disease epidemic that is destroying our children. And that is an existential threat to our nation. When my uncle was president and I was a 10-year-old boy, the rate of chronic disease in this country was 6%. Today, it's 60%. When my uncle was president, we spent zero on chronic disease in this country. There were no drugs to treat it. Today, we spend $4.3 trillion. 4.3 trillion, that's 5 times our military budget. It's the largest cost to our nation, and it is bankrupting us. And it is destroying us morally. Because we are betraying our children by letting these industries poison them. The rate of obesity at that time was 3%. Today, it's 50% in our children. And 74% of Americans are obese or overweight. Well, we didn't suddenly become lazy and gluttonous. We are being mass poisoned by corrupt industry. In Japan, where they don't have this kind of corruption, the obesity rate is 3%. That's what it's supposed to be, 3%. It's not supposed to be 50%. And this is a national security threat. 77% of American kids are no longer qualified for military service because of chronic disease diagnoses. And what are these diseases? They're obesity, they're neurodevelopment disorders, and I'm going to list some of them because I'm a 70-year-old man. And when I was a boy, I never heard of any of these diseases because nobody had them. You know, I had 11 siblings. I had about 70 first cousins. And I didn't know anybody with ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, sleep disorders, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, or autism. The autism rate in my generation today in 70-year-old men is 1 in 10,000. The autism rate in our children is 1 in 34. In California, as Callie just said, it's 1 in 24. And the rate in boys is much higher. We also saw this explosion of autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease and lupus and juvenile diabetes, all of these exotic diseases that we never heard of as a kid. The diabetes rate when I was a kid was effectively 0. A typical pediatrician, when I was a young boy, would see 1 case of diabetes in his lifetime, in his career, a 40 or 50-year career. Today, 1 out of every 3 children who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And nobody's talking about it. Nobody's saying anything. Nobody is recognizing that we are being mass poisoned by big pharma and big food. And all these allergic diseases that suddenly appeared. I never knew a kid anywhere in any of the schools that I went to that had a peanut allergy or food allergies or eczema. My brother had asthma, and he was told by his doctor there will never be a cure for asthma because it's so rare that nobody will ever study it. Today, 1 out of every 8 black children in America's cities has asthma. What is happening to our children? And I saw this happening, and I began writing about it, and the media rose up and silenced me in 2005. And nobody would talk about it. The doctors wouldn't talk about it. The pediatricians wouldn't talk about it. The scientists, the government officials. And people warned me, if you keep talking about this, you're going to destroy your career. And I was stunned by this. And for 19 years, since 2005, I spend 30 minutes praying every day when I get out of bed. And my prayer is this. I ask God for 19 years to put me in a position where I could end the chronic disease epidemic and bring health back to our children. And in August, God sent me Donald Trump. Now, we're 5 days out from an election, and it's an election that we are certain to win. If every vote is counted, if all the votes are counted, we're going to win this election. Oh, now, the medical industrial complex. And I want to remind you of this. I've been told to go on a little longer because President Trump is not yet in the building. You know, I was not going to tell you this. When I was 7 years old, I went to the inauguration of my uncle as president in Washington, D.C. And 3 days before that, President Eisenhower, the outgoing president, made what today we have to regard as the most important speech in American history. And it was the speech where he told Americans that they should be in fear of the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would erode our democracy, that would subvert our democratic institutions, that would steal our money and steal our resources and bankrupt the middle class in this country and make us weak in the long run. And I urge you to go look at that speech, because after he talks about the military-industrial complex, he says, and by the way, just as bad is the medical-industrial complex, which will pervert science, which will lie to the public, which will turn science to serve industrial and corporate interests, the mercantile ambitions of big corporations. Oh. As soon as Donald Trump started talking about giving me the power, he asked me to do three things. He asked me to root out the corruption. And end the conflicts of interest in our regulatory agencies. and end this corporate capture that has turned our regulatory agencies into sock puppets of the industries they're supposed to regulate. And he asked me to restore the tradition of gold standard, empirically based, evidence-based science and medicine in our regulatory agencies. And to restore the transparency so that these agencies must stop hiding science from us when it clashes with the commercial ambitions of the pharmaceutical industry. And he doesn't want me to take vaccines away from people. If you want to take a vaccine, you ought to be able to take it. We believe in free choice in this country. Oh, you ought to know the risks and benefits of everything you take. And we need good science for that. And we need informed consent. And he asked me to do that, and then he asked me to end the chronic disease epidemic in this country. And he said, I want to see results, measurable results, in the diminishment of chronic disease within 2 years. And I said, Mr. President, I will do that. This has caused a lot of aggravation and apoplexy among a certain class of the medical elites. And today, the Washington Post and NBC and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal all did articles talking about what a catastrophe it's going to be if I get anywhere near the medical establishment. And I read the articles because I wanted to see the names of the people who were denouncing me. And every one of them is on the pharma payroll. These are what the media calls experts. But these are the same experts that made us the sickest country in the history of the world. Whatever they're doing is not working. We had, during this country, these are the guys who gave us the COVID countermeasures, which shut down our schools, which closed our churches, which shut down 3.3 million businesses in this country. All the little businesses, and they left open the Walmarts and Facebook and all of the big people who were cashing in on the pandemic. And these are the people who are treating disease. For them, for these people, the most valuable asset in America is a sick child. They don't want your child dead, they want him sick for life. So then he's dependent on their products. And the more statins they prescribe for heart disease, the more heart disease goes up. The more metformin they prescribe for diabetes, the more diabetes we have. The more antidepressants they prescribe, the more people we have who are depressed. The more Ambien they prescribe, the more insomnia there is. The more opioids they prescribe, the more pain there is. The more Viagra they prescribe, the higher ED goes. And so these drugs, their formula, this pharmaceutical paradigm, is not working, and President Trump wants to do something different. And somebody called me one of the anchors of ABC today, and I had an off-the-record discussion with him. And he said, there's so much division in this country. And I said, that's because you're causing it. My nephew, who's traveled with me for 19 months, he's my wife Cheryl's nephew, and he's been working for me for 19 months and traveled everywhere with me, and he's met President Trump many times now. And he said to me today, he said, everybody who's met President Trump loves President Trump. He said, you can't help but love him. So why does half of America hate him? They haven't met him, and the media is telling them to hate him. And I said this, I said, you're demonizing him, you're vilifying him, you're calling us garbage, you're calling him Hitler, you're calling him a fascist, and of course people are going to hate him. And I said, and by the way, you're writing all these articles condemning me coming into Washington, dismantling the pharmaceutical paradigm. Where are you getting your salary? From pharma. And he said, we tell both sides of the story. And I said, no, you don't. And he said, well, President Trump is saying radical things. I said, like what? He said he's going to pull CBS's license. And I said he ought to pull CBS's license. CBS doesn't own the airwaves. We do. The people of the United States own the airwaves. CBS is licensed to use the airwaves, but only for a public purpose, to advance the public benefit. We have a doctrine in this country called the Fairness Doctrine that says if you're licensed to own a network, you got to tell the news at least once a day, and you got to be fair to both sides. And I said to this guy, I said, you know, I was running for 19 months. When Ross Perot ran in 1992 for 10 months, he did 34 live interviews on the airwaves, on the national networks. And I said, I did 4 in 19 months, and your network never let me on a single time. You're only telling one side of the story. And the only thing you'll report about Donald Trump is propaganda to make people despise him. And you know, one of the things I'm going to advise Donald Trump to do in order to correct the chronic disease epidemic is to ban pharmaceutical advertising on TV. There's only 2 countries in the world that allow pharmaceutical advertising on the airwaves. One of them is New Zealand and the other is us. And we have the highest disease rate, and we buy more drugs, and they're more expensive than anywhere in the world. Italy spends about 1/6 that we spend on healthcare, and Italians live 7 years longer. So whatever they're doing does not work. And don't you want a president who is going to fix this country? Don't you want a president who's going to end the addiction to foreign wars? And don't you want a president who's going to end the censorship and surveillance and return freedom of speech to our country. And don't you want a president who's going to clean out the corruption and drain the swamp at the regulatory agencies? And get the chemicals out of our food and protect our children and restore their health and make America the healthiest country in the world, which it was when I was a kid. Oh, you want a president who's going to make America healthy again? And don't we deserve a president who will make America great again? Will you go to the polls on Tuesday and make sure that we all ride that big garbage truck to Washington, D.C.?